Good afternoon. My name is Don Tantiploffel, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to this exciting lecture and discussion in the Institute's Science Lecture Series, the first of the year, with our current emphasis at the intersection of alternative energy and climate change. At the start, let me acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors tuned in this afternoon. Let me also specifically acknowledge the Melanie Mason and David W. Niemiec Fund for Science, which is supporting this event. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. We thank you. Earlier this academic year, in October of 2024, we held our annual science symposium titled Power Shift, Energy Innovation, Sustainability, and Equity. That symposium explored the complex challenges of producing energy more efficiently, more locally, and less harmfully to the environment and our communities. Needless to say, our energy future requires radical innovations in production and distribution, with an emphasis on the equitable division of benefits and burdens across global and local communities. But this is not just about production and distribution. As we'll see today, we must also focus on alternative energy adoption and the decision-making processes of everyday energy users. I note in passing that a full recording of that symposium is available on the Radcliffe website. That major symposium was a key component of our institute-wide and multidisciplinary climate change initiative, our omnibus effort to investigate the causes and consequences of the climate crisis, to develop strategies in adaptation and mitigation, and to address issues of climate justice in thought and in action, analytically, normatively, aesthetically, and imaginatively, and sociopolitically. We particularly seek to address the effects of the climate crisis on marginalized and vulnerable communities, both locally and globally. At the heart of this work is Radcliffe's commitment to supporting and sharing research that promotes innovative solutions and greater equity. This reflects Radcliffe's bedrock commitment to interdisciplinary study, informed by an equally deep dedication to inclusion. We firmly believe that these approaches will generate valuable new insights into effective and equitable ways of addressing climate change. Today's science lecture, titled The Behavioral Economics of Sustainable Energy Use, to be delivered by our featured speaker, Professor Luis Mundaca, brings into focus the Institute's emphasis on addressing climate change from the perspective of concrete action, whether in high-level policy or in the minds, attitudes, and choices of citizens and energy users as such. Consumers' decision-making on adopting alternative energies is often cast as a mysterious black box of unknown factors. What can cutting-edge innovations in the behavioral sciences teach us about effectively promoting sustainable energy behaviors? How can social scientific experiments demystify energy choices and inform policy design and successful implementation? To help guide us, we will learn from Luis Mundaca, professor in the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics at Lund University in Sweden, and an IPCC lead author on climate change mitigation. I am especially gratified not only to introduce Professor Mundaca, but also to join Luis in conversation and Q&A after his presentation. On behalf of Professor Mundaca, I encourage those here to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit questions at any time during the program. Please keep your questions concise so that we can explore as many topics as possible. It is now my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Luis Mundaca.
Hi, Don. Thank you very much for that introduction, and many thanks to Harvard University and the Radcliffe Institute for this very kind invitation. Okay, so I would like to start this presentation with with a following question, a simple question, you might say. What is the potential for small changes in decision environments to generate significant positive impacts on energy use and the reduction of carbon emissions? And this is the question that I would like to answer during my presentation. Then you might wonder why this specific question. My point of departure for this presentation relates to the importance of behavior change and decision-making in energy and climate policy. I think that I've had the privilege to be part of the IPCC, as Don mentioned. This included a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. In that report, we assess multiple emission pathways that have the potential to limit global warming and keep the goals of the Paris Agreement within reach. The figure on the right here illustrates this, showing that basically CO2 emissions need to peak between 2025 and 2030 and must reach net zero by 2050. When all these mitigation pathways are analyzed in detail, one can notice a common pattern. That is that behavior change and sustainable energy use emerge as fundamental enabling factors. So the question now is, what can behavioral economics do from a policy perspective to help us materialize these mitigation pathways? To address this question, my presentation is divided in three main parts. Part one, I would like to explain some basic foundational concepts in behavioral economics that are relevant to sustainable energy use and climate action in particular. Then in part two, I would like to synthesize the evidence of policy-oriented research fostering sustainable energy behaviors. And in part three, I would like to elaborate on some overarching policy lessons and briefly, very briefly, propose some directions for future research. So let us start with the foundations of behavioral economics within this field. So the first question is, what is behavioral economics? In simple terms, and at the risk of oversimplification, behavioral economics deals with the cognitive, motivational, and contextual factors that affect people's decision-making processes and resulting associated choices, in particular, in this case, in relation to energy use. The first aim of behavioral economics in this area is realism. What do I mean by this? I think that an important promise of behavioral economics is that it seeks to create a much more realistic understanding of energy behaviors from an economic point of view. A second aim is accuracy. What do I mean by this? By improving realism, behavioral economics aims to improve the accuracy of economic analysis in relation to energy use and resulting environmental impacts. That means that what we try to do is to provide better theoretical frameworks, better policies, and better predictions about these policies, of course, with a particular focus on energy users or consumer behavior. There are two focal points, in my view, that for behavioral economics are quite important in this field. The first one relates to contextual factors. A fundamental postulate in behavioral economics is that decisions are context-specific and vary over time. In addition, science is telling us that we don't really know very well our own preferences, which leave us susceptible to contextual influencers. Then another, let's say, focal point is that we have intrinsic or individual factors. This refers basically to the idea that internal features or qualities can influence our own behavior, motivation, action, as opposed to external factors. Here, the focus of behavioral economics is often on the psychographics of energy users, including, of course, their habits and also moral concerns. Now, I would like to briefly touch upon the concept of behavioral anomalies. Why, you might ask? Well, behavioral anomalies are patterns or factors that explain why we as individuals fail to behave as the rational choice theory predicts, or why basically we make systematic errors that can undermine our own interest. Understanding these behavioral anomalies, I think that is very crucial for designing policy interventions that can, in this case, encourage a much more sustainable energy use. The question is, what kinds of behavioral anomalies prevent people from using energy sustainably? Well, there are many, and the ones that I have chosen here are the ones that, according to my knowledge, are very often found in the literature. So let me explain this very briefly for you. The first one relates to heuristics. These are what I call rules of thumb. These are simplified or intuitive decision-making rules that often lead to immediate but suboptimal choices or incorrect outcomes. Then we have a choice overload. This is the difficulty that individuals have in making a choice when presented with too many options. Then one can also recognize limited attention. And this is the cognitive constraint, which is often defined, particularly coming from environmental psychology or psychology, often defined as the limited rate by which our brains can process information. Then we have loss aversion, another type of important anomaly in this area, and that is basically the tendency of people or individuals to place a greater value on losses rather than gains. Then we have the status quo bias, which is a preference for the current state of affairs that often, as you might imagine, leads to inertia. Then we have procrastination. This is often understood. I think that we all know more or less what that means, that postponing something unnecessarily, which often leads, unfortunately, to delayed decisions, failure to act, or basically acceptance for the status quo. And finally, present bias. This is the inclination to prefer a smaller reward today rather than a larger reward in the future. Now, from a policy perspective, the question is, how can we overcome or reduce these anomalies? Here, I would like to take you to the concept of choice intervention techniques that can help us to do that, actually, to address these behavioral anomalies. So what are they? Choice intervention techniques refer basically to the simple idea that changes in the decision environment can positively affect individual decision-making and behavior while preserving freedom of choice. This is very important. The main purpose here with these choice intervention techniques is to anticipate and somehow integrate to our best, let's say, capacities, people's motivation, people's cognitive limitation into the decision-making process. There are three main categories of choice interventions. First, we have decision information. These are choice interventions that cover the way that information is presented to energy users and how this subsequently influences their choices. Then we have decision assistant. These are choice interventions that aim to further support energy users so they can follow through their intended actions. And then we have decision structure. These are choice interventions that cover the arrangement or preparation, you might say, of energy use choices and, importantly, related decision-making formats. I will provide a specific example about this choice intervention during the second part of my presentation, by the way. So now, how are these choice interventions often evaluated? Well, there are two main assessment criteria that dominate existing studies. The first one is about effectiveness. That means, or what we try to explore here is whether choice interventions are able to meet their intended outcomes in the short term. These outcomes can be energy savings, of course, or reductions in peak energy demand, or the market uptake of green electricity. And the other evaluation criterion here relates to persistence. And this refers basically to what extent these choice interventions are in the position to maintain those outcomes in the long term. So now I would like to summarize actually the evidence of a number of policy instruments that have used these choice intervention techniques, mostly through randomized controlled trials, by the way, to promote sustainable energy use. I have selected approximately 30 cases from multiple countries that hopefully I'm hoping that will provide an interesting overview of what we know until today. So let us talk first about social comparison. This is an important type of decision information intervention promoting sustainable energy use. In simple terms, this refers to the process of giving consumers information about their energy use, but in relation to the energy use of compatible households. So this approach, as you might imagine, uses social norms to encourage behavior change. And this is quite important because people tend to adjust their consumption based on how they compare to their peers. This is also significant because many people exhibit reference-dependent preferences. And in this case, what others do can constitute a reference point in their decision-making process. Here, what you can see are two examples. The most well-known, I would say, is the Home Energy Report in the US. Some of you might be familiar with this, implemented by Opower. I think that this was back in 2007, if my memory is correct. The other one comes from Sweden, actually, and this is provided by my own electricity supplier. It compares my energy use to the average consumption of similar houses, including the most energy efficient homes. So what can we say about the effectiveness of social comparison, these policy experiments taking place around the world? The first thing to notice here, if you look at the numbers, is that the evidence actually is quite mixed. For example, in Germany, research shows that social norms can reduce energy use and related carbon emissions by 0.7% compared to a control group, of course. In Japan, this level is slightly higher in the proximity of 1.5%. And for the US, research assessing these home energy reports has estimated energy savings in the range of 1.4 up to 3.3%. In Sweden, this level is relatively much higher, close to a 7%. However, it has to be acknowledged that some studies also had found zero net effects. So the evidence, I would say, is quite mixed here. Persistent, what can we say about persistent? Research here shows that it can decrease over time. For example, in the first week, when we look at the empirical evidence, one can observe that energy use reductions can take place and in the proximity of 10%. However, they soon fade away. Nevertheless, it's also fair to say that there are some positive indications from Opower in this case. So if I can put together, and please allow me to oversimplify it here, I think that the evidence tells us that there is cost-effective potential, particularly from cases like the one implemented by Opower in the US. However, I think that a lot more attention is needed on consumption patterns, particularly regarding rebound or boomerang effects. What do I mean by this? This is when low-intensity energy users actually increase their energy consumption as a result of this comparison. In addition, there is a lot, I think that there is a need for better understanding about causality. We need to ask the questions whether energy users change their habits, use new technologies, or both. Now, let me briefly talk about goal and commitment devices. These are important type of decision assistant type of choice intervention. Goal and commitment devices, they are interventions that in a way are very simple actually. They allow individuals to lock themselves today into the action that they want to take tomorrow. The idea behind these interventions, I think that is quite clever, is quite simple, because we know that some people have time inconsistent preferences. For instance, many people procrastinate to the extent that the desired action actually is never taken. So by committing to save energy and setting specific goals, these interventions help individuals to overcome time inconsistent preferences by providing a source of motivation. So it compares the present situation with a desired future state. So what can we say about the effectiveness of goal and commitment devices? We again can observe a high degree of variation. For example, when the energy saving goal is set anywhere between 0 and 15%, policy experiments show that energy users save up to 11%. But when the goal is set much higher, for example, at a level of 25%, energy users actually save much less. Persistence, I think that it is often a noun, I would say. However, whenever this is measured, the experience showed that it can be maintained over 6 months or even longer. So, of course, one can immediately say that this might be, let's say, the outcome of other factors, and perhaps this is something that we can discuss during the Q&A session. Evidence, and again, allow me to oversimplify here. If we put together all the evidence now, I think that results point to a relatively high energy conservation potential. However, this area requires much more research. For example, if goals are realistic, then we need to ask whether they are relevant from a policy perspective. In addition, some studies, we have to acknowledge this, also test commitment and goal devices with other choice interventions, which add some kind of complexity and uncertainty to the attribution of these effects. Now I would like to move on and touch upon decision structure, and here I am going to be talking specifically about green energy defaults. So what are green energy defaults? These again might be maybe familiar to you. These are preset options that automatically enroll people to use renewable energy sources like wind or solar, unless, and this is the important part, unless they choose otherwise. Therefore, these green energy defaults aim to promote alternative sources of energy. And the idea is to make these choices the easiest one, the automatic options. While again, I need to emphasize this because this is quite important, while still preserving the freedom of choice of energy users. So, what can we say again about the effectiveness of policy experiments dealing with green energy defaults? Well, if we first consider lab experiments, we can notice that the choice of green electricity is often higher compared to a standard energy default. What do I mean by a standard energy default? An energy default that offers basically electricity based on fossil fuels. Okay. By the way, here, please pay attention that the numbers indicate adoption rates. And as you can see from those numbers, they're relatively high in the range of 40 to 80%. However, the evidence from these lab experiments need to be compared with natural or field experiments, I would say. And here, the level of effectiveness, as you can notice, has been found to be much higher. Adoption rates are in the range of 80% for the case of Switzerland, for example, or even up to 99% in the case of Germany. Persistent, it is found, to be relatively high, and outcomes, it is quite interesting, that remain quite robust for about 4 or 6 years. But here there is one key condition, that this persistent is highly dependent on tariff agreements between users and electric utilities. The evidence put in all together, I think that is telling us that there is high potential to foster the market uptake of renewable energy. The challenge, though, I would say that the experience is still concentrated on a handful number of countries, where energy markets are highly liberalized, energy users have a relatively high level of environmental awareness and also high disposable income. So we need to be careful about these specific conditions as well. So that was a global, very brief, you might say, overview about the state of the art in this field. Now, allow me to briefly discuss some overarching policy implications and very briefly propose some future directions for research. Let us address some direct policy implications first. First, the outcomes of choice interventions are very context dependent. I really want to emphasize this. This is because contexts have very unique features. As you can imagine, they're shaped by numerous factors, including cultural issues, economic structures, climatic conditions, demographic compositions, policy environments, you name it, not to mention the psychographics of energy users. Therefore, I think that we need to be careful with external validity claims. Choice interventions that might be effective in one context might not be in another. So this is an important point that I would like to emphasize here. Then, economic assessment are needed. As you probably notice, we have been talking quite a lot about behavior of the behavioral economics part, but not so much about the economic part. This is why I think that there are some good indications. Unfortunately, I would say there is a lack of evidence in this particular regard. Maybe this is something that we can discuss during the Q&A session. So data is quite limited. But we need to ask whether these interventions are cost-effective or economically efficient. This is heavily needed to support the policymaking process, I would say. And this is also quite important to prevent this kind of mistaken view or misperception that these choice interventions are costless, which is obviously not the case. And then the experience over the last decades is clearly showing that these choice interventions work better when combined with, for example, other policy instruments, economic incentives. So the challenge here is for researchers and policymakers to maximize the complementarities and synergies between these choice interventions and traditional policy instruments. Now let us address some indirect policy implications. The experience here underscores something very important, particularly from a methodological point of view, from a scientific point of view, and that is the role of evidence-based policy evaluation. This is quite essential really to support policymaking processes, but also to make the necessary adjustments before the potential large-scale implementation of these pilot experiments. Then I think that much greater focus must be given to well-being, side effects, and organizations. The evidence really highlights that we need to broaden the analytical scope. For example, it is obviously very crucial to preserve the freedom of choice of energy users, but it's also quite important to enhance their well-being. And as you can imagine, welfare issues are very important to capture the attention of policymakers. Another lesson is to strengthen the governance of behavioral interventions across pretty much all the stages of energy and climate policy cycle. I think that here policymakers and regulators should establish clear principles and ethical guidelines for designing, implementing, and addressing choice interventions. I think that we need to understand how and to what extent behavioral insights in general are really integrated into policy. And I think that this is very crucial in order to increase the transparency and accountability of behavioral economics in this field. And finally, I would like to conclude with some, let's say, general remarks. And here I would like to go back to my initial question. Perhaps you might remember, what is the potential for small changes in decision environments to generate significant positive impacts on energy use and obviously reduce carbon emissions? I think that behavioral economics shows promise in driving sustainable energy and reducing carbon emissions. However, I think that much of the experience in the last 4 decades is heavily concentrated on OECD countries. And I would say to a large extent, initiatives coming from utilities and the academia. Therefore, my strong suggestion here is that we need to go beyond these specific areas in order to increase scientific and policy knowledge. Then there are some key challenges, I would say. They include scalability, persistence, and the economics of these interventions. For behavioral economics to deliver its full potential, policymakers and behavioral scientists need to work much more closely together. I think that we also need systematic follow-up assessments, because we need to understand what works best and for whom, and who benefits the most from these interventions in the long term. And finally, I think that behavioral interventions have the potential to generate these positive impacts, but they're not the panacea, they're not the silver bullet. Experience is clearly showing that they can complement but not replace other policy instruments. My take on this is that an ambitious policy mix is really essential, and this is critically important if we really want to drive a much more sustainable energy future. Thank you very much, and now I think that I would like to give the virtual floor back to Dawn.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Luis, if I may. We have so much to discuss, and I just want to mention to the audience, during our discussion, we'll also be taking some questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A box, the bottom of your screen, to submit your questions. We'll get to as many as we can. But thank you, Luis, for a fantastic presentation. So much to explore. I'd like to ask a question, a first question about GED, green energy defaults.
Okay.
I'd like to ask, in thinking about the success or lack of success or unclarity about the success of green energy defaults, what kind of controls are you thinking about in trying to determine that? What are some of the other factors in thinking about whether green energy defaults are successful? Could you sort of explore a little bit or show for our audience what are some of the factors that you want to think about in measuring the potential effectiveness of GEDs?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Don, for this question. Yes, actually, we have done research on green energy defaults. I had the opportunity to participate in one of these policy experiments. Um, Actually, when we look at green energy defaults, I think that the intervention is relatively simple, if I may say so.
Mhm.
Usually what you have, at least in the lab, what you have is obviously participants. You ask them in very simple terms to imagine that they have just moved to a new town or new community, new city, and they are informed by a local energy supplier of the available electricity tariffs. So that is the, let's say, general entry point for these policy experiments. Usually what you have here are often three groups. One in which an energy supplier offer green electricity as a default. So that's the important one, you might say. The other group that you have is one in which fossil fuel-based electricity is offered as a default. In these two conditions, of course, the person have to do nothing if they want to stick to the default, either the green or the gray. That is the typical kind of jargon that you find in these initiatives. And of course, if they want, they can choose otherwise. They can opt in or opt out depending on the type of fault that they're confronting. And then what you usually have is another group in which participants are not offer any default, and they have to make an active choice whether they have to take the green or the fossil fuel-based electricity. That is often the control group. There are, as I said during my presentation, I think that there are very good indications from lab experiments that green energy defaults can be effective. I mean, again, think about that with this, we try to address choice overload, for example. We try to also address the status quo. We try to address heuristics. So we try to maintain the mental load to the lowest possible level. And then what lab experiments are telling us are that they can be quite effective in the range of, as I said, in Switzerland, 80%, Germany, 99%. There are some key conditions. I would say that the majority of the studies that I have seen obviously concentrate in countries in which environmental awareness is relatively high. For instance, in those specific cases being implemented in Germany. Then, of course, because in certain countries, green electricity comes with a premium, then you can see that there is some kind of correlation between these studies and participants or, let's say, energy users with a relatively higher disposable income. So people can obviously afford these tariffs. So you can see that there are some maybe market conditions, psychographic conditions as well, that influence the success of these green energy defaults.
Fantastic. Exactly right. That I was curious about the psychographic conditions. I was curious. Again, I know this is probably an area for much more future work, comparative work. But I was wondering, how would your work, the findings that you've generated, the findings of your peers, how would it work if we're thinking about um, energy users in developing economies or in lower income contexts, thinking of places where maybe there is less disposable income or maybe even less energy information. Are there any inferences or hypotheses that you could think about for these other contexts, other than, let's say, um, the post-industrial economies that we've been thinking about?
Yes, perhaps here if I may say so, it is important maybe to expand the discussion beyond the specific, let's say, choice interventions that I mentioned. I use basically three examples, but for instance, in developing countries or developing nations, you can see that feedback can be often used. We can see that in certain countries, the energy efficiency potentials or potentials for energy conservation are very high. So feedback, targeted feedback, frequent feedback, and so on and so forth can be particularly effective. We also know that energy efficiency, not to mention energy conservation, are very profitable, some of them at zero cost. So then, let's say, disposable income is not really an important variable to be considered. The evidence that I've seen nevertheless indicates that the provision of information is important but not sufficient. So when we deal or when we address this kind of or implement these kind of interventions in developing nations, or let's say less wealthy communities, I would say so, it's not only important how the information is given or presented to the energy users, but how that information is actually designed. So then energy users can better use that information and hopefully internalize that into their daily habits.
Fantastic. I think that internalization point is probably a very difficult one because it takes it takes a while for the internalization to happen. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about ways of researching ways of discovering the different weights between social norms and whether that's one way in which people make decisions versus like formal incentives or more formal disincentives. Do you have any thoughts about how we could come to further study and further knowledge about the different weights between social norms as a causal factor versus maybe perhaps a textbook case of the most formal case would be the economic part, less of the behavioral part and more of the economic part. How can we make some progress between those two different factors?
Right. Let me structure my answer here. It's a very interesting question because it brings together a number of issues. On the one hand, it brings the aspect that I mentioned before about how relevant context is. And then social norms in particular. Let me perhaps start with context. As I said during my presentation, I think that it's very important that we consider that while some of these interventions might work in certain countries, communities, cities, you name it, they might not necessarily be effective in another context, even though we are exactly designing and implementing the very same choice intervention technique. And here, I think that there are some important contextual reasons for this. Market conditions, we have been already talking about, for instance, energy tariffs. So if, for instance, if energy prices or energy use is heavily subsidized, I mean, that kind of choice intervention, fostering, for example, energy conservation is very likely to fail, okay? Then policy conditions are also very important. If you have a very strong policy mix or policy environment, certainly a choice intervention will have the opportunity to support that and find better synergies or better complementarities between those two type of sets of policy interventions. And then we move into, let's say, the social context. This is because people do not make decisions in isolation. I mean, they're influenced by cultural values, peer behavior, institutional trust, social structures. So here is when social norms, I think, that come into the picture, according to my knowledge. For those of you that might be wondering about what social norms are, I mean, these are a very simple definition, by the way. These are unwritten rules or expectations about what guide our behaviors in our group or society or even community. Here, very often, we address with two types of social norms: descriptive norms That is what most people do in a given situation, and then injunctive norms, what people should do. In our case, we have done research addressing these two. We had found, for instance, that injunctive norms, basically telling people what they should do, are more effective than descriptive norms in promoting low carbon transportation choices. This has been quite interesting to see. However, at the same time, we have done other studies, for instance, addressing high income earners, and using social norms to promote, let's say, a much more sustainable consumption behavior. And here we had found that injunctive norms do not work. You might ask why? Well, we have seen a number of things, but when high income earners basically do not engage in sustainable consumption, that becomes the descriptive norm. And in our case, the injunctive norms is in conflict, is telling them to do something different from what they are doing. And when there is conflict between what is happening in reality, the descriptive norm, and what they're supposed to do, that means the injunctive norms, then often what studies are telling us is that this conflict reduces the influence of injunctive norms. But again, this is very context specific. And this might be applicable for Sweden, but might not be applicable for other countries.
Just to build on that, these distinctions, and I'm drawing from questions from the audience. So please, members of the audience, please keep them coming in. I was wondering how, I don't know if we want to put it on the social norm side or the injunctive side, but I'm thinking about a question came in about the choice interventions in this ecosphere of rivals. So the rival could be advertising from private interests, or so this is one way of thinking about a question. I think is, are there interesting questions for you about choice interventions which are meant to adopt or promote sustainable energy practices, but in the context of advertising or propaganda that goes in the exact opposite direction of consuming more energy or buying more things? And how do we figure out what the right answer is about the choice interventions, given that the ecosphere is so competitive?
Yeah, I understand. Here, what I can share is a little bit of the methodology that we use and how we go about this, because you're absolutely right. On the one hand, to give maybe a very simple example, I mean, our experiments try to promote sustainable energy use, while we see a very heavy industry promoting completely the opposite, right? Sometimes even very unsustainable consumption patterns. So how do we integrate this challenging marketing environment, you might say? So maybe I can walk you through very briefly the type of methodology that we use and how we integrate these issues. I mean, first of all, we need to understand the features of energy users. We need to identify the behaviors that need to be changed. We want to promote better, transportation modes, obviously energy conservation, and so on and so forth. So we need to pay close attention to high impact factors here, the behaviors that use a lot of energy or release a lot of carbon emissions. And here we need to examine then the anomalies, the ones that I presented before, that might be potentially driving those behaviors, whether we are talking about present bias, loss aversion, choice overload, you name it. Then when we have identified the situation that we want to address at the individual level, then I think that it's time for us to go into this more structural level. Okay, what are the external factors? What are the market conditions? What are the policy conditions that might be also influencing these, you might say, unsustainable behaviors? And then we need to pay attention to this. Are people being framed to travel more, to use their cars more? Are people being forced maybe to use their cars because there is no public transportation? So these are the kind of exercises that we often do. After that, obviously, it's time for the implementation. And here the role of RCTs is very important. And then, if I can skip that, that is probably a much more technical, let's say, question that maybe some people will have some questions about how RCTs work in this particular area. But then we need to assess the interventions. And here we can pay attention to not only to these individual factors, the psychographics that I mentioned before, and here by psychographics, I mean the values, the attitudes, the beliefs, the interest, the lifestyle of people, but also to other structural issues, energy pricing, structure, the options for public transport, and so on and so forth. So then from a methodological point of view, we can weight which one of these variables may have a much more powerful determination in the outcome that we are addressing. That is how I would answer that specific question, Don.
Fantastic, fantastic. So if I may, I'm going to also just field the question from the Q&A, and fantastic questions are coming in. So please, to the audience, keep them coming. Very rich questions. Sort of still in the level of sort of maybe even more abstractly in behavioral economics. I'm curious, one audience member is curious. Have you you mentioned a lot of the sort of mechanisms of behavioral anomalies at the start. And one audience member asks, intriguingly, do you have a suspicion about any new ones? As in maybe our menu of behavioral anomalies might be getting larger. Do you have a sense that there's how would we discern a new kind of anomalous psychological mechanism? Do you have any hunches that maybe new ones are at work, or undiscovered ones are at work, and how could we figure out if there's any new ones to add to our menu of anomalous dispositions?
I mean, yes and no, and apologize immediately for that type of answer. Yes, in the sense that I've seen studies that are recognizing a lot more behavioral anomalies in general. I've seen even some, let's say, people that have listed more than 100 anomalies. So obviously there is a growing list of potential anomalies that can influence at least the way that we use energy, and in turn the way that we somehow drive greenhouse gas emissions. Nevertheless, I feel relatively confident that the ones that I mentioned during my presentation, present bias, status quo, limited attention, and so on and so forth, dominate, I would say, very much the anomalies that these policy experiments aim to address with these choice interventions. At least here in Europe, and certainly for the particular case in Sweden, I don't really have any particular type of anomaly that might be becoming more, let's say, relevant. However, I have to say that the distinction between behavioral anomalies and behavioral failures is an important debate in the scientific community. So the topic being posed by one member of the audience actually is quite important, because it relates to, you might say, a heated debate among scientists. And here, if I can just briefly describe this debate, I mean, everything boils down to when behavioral anomalies lead to a systematic difference between decision utility and experience utility, then these anomalies are categorized as behavioral failures. And this is very important because behavioral failures are more systematic and they provide better grounds for policy interventions. The analogy here is market failures, behavioral failures, okay? In economics, to oversimplify a little bit here the discussion. However, of course, some scholars argue that behavioral anomalies should be simply understood as cognitive constraints that need to be considered in whenever we try to maximize our utility. So, which means that anomaly detection becomes very important, and this relates heavily to the scientific procedures that we use in order to identify these anomalies. So, so this specific area is an important debate in behavioral economics, particularly in the one that I am kind of involved. So as you can see, a lot of ramifications associated to this.
That's fantastic. If I may, I want to continue with that line of thought, that response, which is very, very informative. And I wonder, in thinking about this, and please correct me if I'm misphrasing it, but you might think, I'm wondering whether you've run up against, let's say, an ethicist who might say, no, these are not behavioral anomalies is too lightweight a term. We're talking about irrationality, and we are, the primary goal is to correct. We should inform citizens, our co-citizens. We should correct for this anomalous behavior as opposed to adapting our policies towards it. We actually should sort of strive for full transparency, and we should actually expect our co-citizens to be rational decision makers of a gold standard, of the highest standard. Everything else is kind of some kind of coercion is too strong a word, but we should strive for full transparency and full rationality on the part of our co-citizens. Anything less is something we shouldn't compromise with. Is there a way in which you have a response to that kind of critique?
Yes, here there are two important issues. I think I'm very glad to receive these questions. They're extremely important, and yeah, at least the community has been discussing these issues, I think that for a relatively long time, and we are still searching for answers, I would say. But if I can, again, let's say, give you a sense of what is out there, in my view at least, obviously the issue of rationality, or either bounded or unbounded rationality, plays an important role here. I think that rational decision, what is that? Is one that is made carefully, right? Considering all of the available options and choosing the one that maximizes our benefits or utility, obviously based on our own preferences and available information. The issue, though, here is that behavioral economics challenges this. As I said during my presentation, we challenge this rational choice theory, which is a very dominant, let's say, theoretical framework in a standard, particularly in neoclassical economics, where there are some really strong assumptions there. Like, for instance, obviously our preferences are very stable, even in the long run. We use all of the available information. We always maximize utility under budget constraints. And obviously, we do all of that with impeccable optimization skills. I would love to be that person, to be honest, but I am not. I am not really that perfect. So, which means that I fall into the so-called unbounded rational individual. From that, let's say, area, I would like to move into, you might say, what is an important debate in this particular area, particularly from a policy perspective. And that relates to, well, libertarian paternalism. And how do we use actually all these choice intervention techniques as a policy approach? And here the debate revolves around the following issues, if I can summarize again. Basically, as some of you might know, libertarian paternalism postulates the feasibility and validity. This is very important, to affect people's behavior, but at the same time preserve their freedom of choice. Basically, proponents say that we can help individuals to make better choices, irrational choices, and we make them now to make rational choices. So we respect their autonomy while we address cognitive biases and decision-making flaws. In a summary, that is what proponents are saying. But of course, as you raised, Don, there are some critiques. I mean, some people argue that this approach manipulates people and can influence choices without individuals fully realizing this process. In addition, I think that this is particularly important. This approach assumes that policymakers know best for individuals. So policymakers are the rational ones, okay? which can be considered, at least in certain countries or let's say societies, quite elitist or obviously quite paternalistic. So this is a little bit of a debate. In certain countries, this might be labeled as greater paternalism within a society and market-oriented liberalism, while here, for instance, in some European countries, this debate is often framed as greater liberalism within a state-driven paternalism. So you can see the two different angles. Whether one of these might be more or less applicable to the United States, I think that is for the audience here to decide. Huh?
Great, fantastic answer. And I think I want to ask just one last question, and I think this might be our closing question, but I think it's very close, related to the dynamics you just helpfully sketched, Luis. So what would your advice be about the shape of one of the topics you ended with? What would be a way of thinking through the governance of choice interventions? What are some of the guardrails that you might want for the scientific community, for the research community to think about the right way of what kinds of choice interventions are out of bounds and what ones are perhaps acceptable?
Right. I think that the ones that we have touched upon during the discussion, even those, even the ones that I didn't explicitly address during my presentation, I mentioned, for instance, feedback, framing, priming. I think that they're all quite valid in my humble opinion. But you are totally right, and this is why I really wanted to address. I think that there is a need to clearly state some guidance, ethical principles about how do we integrate this in policies. How do we integrate all these behavioral insights? And here I have to, if I may, kind of open a little bit the scope of this discussion, because obviously it's not only about behavioral economics, but there are other disciplines as well. We have environmental psychology. Psychology is an important, let's say, contributor to this field. We have social psychology, we have anthropology, economics in general. So there are many disciplines contributing to this and providing a lot of behavioral insights into policy making processes. But I think that for the public, for the purposes of accountability and transparency, I think that everybody needs to know better how are these behavioral insights integrated into the design of the policies. Then how are these behavioral insights integrated into the implementation of these policies? And how do we, for instance, scientists or policymakers, actually assess these behavioral insights by the time we want to conduct an ex post assessment? I think that all these aspects can just add value, increase the value of behavioral economics in general. And I think that everybody should welcome that discussion.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much, Luis. That will be our last question for the event. Thank you so much, Luis, for joining us. And thank you to the audience as well. I do want to say one thing before my official conclusion, which I think, Luis, I think you would agree with me that these questions are context dependent. Maybe the choice interventions are elitist, but the absence of thinking about choice interventions are probably just as elitist or just as putting your finger on the scales, just as biasing. And there's no default settings. We have all kinds of places by which we get formed and our decisions are made in ways that we are not fully in control of. So I think that these mechanisms and thinking about this have been very, very useful. Thank you, Luis. I will conclude if I may, but Luis, do you want to say a final word?
No, thank you very much, Don, again for this for the opportunity to give this presentation. Thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you to the audience for posing those questions. They were really great questions. I hope that I did my best to provide you with the best possible answers, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you for your time and attention.
Oh, thank you, Professor Mundaca. This concludes our program today. I want to thank Luis. I want to thank the audience for excellent questions. Today's program has been recorded and we posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For more information, please visit the Radcliffe website, radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and take care.